Hello and welcome to this special panel discussion, which is part of the Smart Energy Education Initiative. My name is Patricia Schuker, and I'm the Director of Strategy at a cybersecurity company called Poliswarm. I am also a non-resident fellow at the Science Diplomacy Center at the Fletcher School and the Payne Institute. And I'll be serving as your moderator this morning. I hope you enjoyed the screening of the war episode of the PBS and Amazon Prime series Power Trip, the story of energy. Filmed around the world, Power Trip really uncovers the hidden energy that is embedded in our modern way of life and takes viewers on a journey through the past, present, and future of energy. So this is especially true in the war episode. I learned a lot, new things watching, and I hope you did as well. I am particularly excited for this discussion with you all because a lot of students, professionals, regardless of age, always ask us how to engage with other professionals like yourself in the energy and policy sector. And second, I think particularly in the era of the pandemic crisis, but also the current geopolitical crisis, I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to bring people together on this platform. So before I introduce our esteemed speakers, I wanted to let the audience know that you can submit questions to our panel via the OVE platform, a chat feature. Both I and our host at KLRN will be keeping an eye on the chat. So keep those questions coming in. I'll make sure that I'll relay those to our guests. I'm excited to help facilitate what is sure to be an exciting and educational conversation. We're joined by Dr. Michael Weber, energy expert, author of the book Power Trip, The Story of Energy, and professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas, Austin. So, hi, Michael. Sir Matt Hames, co-founder of Alpheus Media and director of the Power Trip series. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
And Sharon Burke, founder and president of Ecospherics, apologies. I can't do justice to everyone's background here. You definitely have a really impressive background, but I want to be mindful of our time. So without further ado, let's get started. So I will start with you, Michael. So as I was reading the book and watching the war episode, I had to highlight the fact that you really managed to bring together your own personal journey and tie into your academic and your professional journey. So I recall vividly the conversation we had in Paris, actually, and the stories, professional experiences that you've had. So tell me about your motivation to bring us back into the history of energy in the context of war, particularly in moments of crises, in moments of uncertainty that we all are right now, regardless of where we sit. So how do stories, episodes like this one, spearhead the tri-generational, given that we have all generational, the call probably, and attendees approach to the issue of energy security? So how do you bring history that can be applied to the present and shape the future?
Great. Thank you, Patricia. Good to see you again, and thanks so much for being part of this conversation. I've had the chance to work on different issues over my career and live in different places like Texas and California and New England and Switzerland and France. And as you travel around the world, you can't help but notice that one of the common threads is the importance of energy, because the access to energy that we take for granted in the United States really enables a vibrant economy and gives us all these freedoms. But then it also introduces some vulnerabilities. If energy is not available because of a winter storm or because of a military event, then we start to appreciate its absence. And through the process of learning about energy, I've had the opportunity to bump into really smart people like Sharon Burke along the way, who we keep crossing paths. She comes at it from different angles, but we come to the same conclusions about our security and about our economy and about the importance of energy. And so it just seems important to me. And so I thought, well, maybe as a professor, I should write about it and talk about it. And then I had the opportunity to team up with Matt Hames and some other people who are really good at good storytelling to explain energy to a broader audience. So that's kind of the motivation, just that with different perspectives from around the world and different career steps, energy pops up as a continuous theme that's important. What can I do to help educate the world about it and also get smart on it myself? In Power Trip, the book or the series or these conversations are just one part of this broader effort to make sure everyone can do their part to be smart on energy.
Oh, that's awesome, Michael. I can definitely tell you that the feedback that everyone shared about, your book and also this episode is key, right? Because we also have to educate the next generation to get them into the energy sector. So I'll transition over to Matt, because you have an absolutely amazing background, Matt. You've traveled the world, doing many other, films and so forth. So I would love to hear, what were your takeaways about energy when, what did you walk away with after making those episodes?
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and great to see everybody. I think reading the chapter of Michael's book, which was originally titled Security, in the book it's titled Security, we changed the name to War for the series. There's a lot there. There's a lot of meat and rich content that Michael had already put in the chapter. So it, rather than straight up kind of adapting that chapter and taking, doing an hour-long interview with Michael, we not only did an hour-long interview with Michael, but we brought in a lot of other voices. And I had the fortune of being able to speak to former Secretary of Energy in the United States. I was able to go to Oxford and talk to smart people at West Point, MIT, Harvard, and other places for these episodes. And I think that the thing that was really interesting to me was how much war changed from before modern energy to after modern energy. And some people say that the modern energy impacted war around World War I. There are some that say that it really started around the Civil War. But regardless, before there was modern energy, war usually had to be fought in the spring or summertime. It had to be fought in the daytime. There were all of these sort of limits put on it by nature that once you had mechanized warfare and you had oil and gas and you had all these other things, nuclear energy powering things, you could go under the ocean. You could, you could attack at night. You could bomb cities from the air. All these things that were made possible by modern energy, for good or for ill.
No, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. And I, like you said, seeing everything live, right? Being there, having those conversations, you can't compensate it from in any other way, right? As opposed to just read. And of course, it's important as well, but I think seeing him firsthand is really making the difference. And I think it's a good way to mention the whole notion of energy security, because it's been a keyword out there. It became frequently used. The Economist had their front page on energy and security, but it's also one of the most poorly defined term as well. I think, to give a context for folks out there, but also to summarize a little bit of what you've been showing, Michael, in that episode. I mean, we would define energy security as a low vulnerability of vital energy systems. So there are two main ideas packed into that definition, I think. And I would love to also hear your thoughts, Sharon, on that. So I would say, the way you've portrayed that documentary, the first idea is that it's not energy security of a black box, right? But it's energy security of specific systems. Like you've mentioned in documentary, electricity security, energy security of oil used in transport. And then the second idea that's packed into the definition is the idea of vulnerability, which you really emphasize on in the documentary to look at how energy security concerns have changed throughout history. And I think you identify three persistent types of concerns. The first being the sovereignty perspective. I think answering the question of who controls energy. So are we importing all of our oil from one country, from Saudi Arabia to Russia, which I would love to chat on, or are we producing it domestically? The second, I think, that really was portrayed in the documentary is how long will our energy system last, and the robustness perspective. And that's really about, are we going to run out of energy? Is the infrastructure ready to hold up the different types of threats? And last but not least, the resilience perspective. So when we face a disruption, how fast can the system respond and recover? So Sharon, I would love to see, what can you offer by way of a definition of energy security? And you've seen the progression, especially serving in current and previous administration, and the key dimensions.
Well, thank you, Patricia. And it's interesting defining energy security. It really does depend on your point of view. So I was talking to someone who worked for a public utilities commission once, and I asked him, well, how do you define energy security? And he said, well, energy security, honestly, is if my governors at the end of the day have a cold beer and a hot shower. So, but you get the point, which is it's about services and whether or not you have the services that energy brings you. My background is particularly in the Department of Defense, and as a former senior official, as a former assistant secretary, I would see it also as an input to war and as a shaper of war. And that's how I would define energy security. But as you said, right now we're getting an object lesson in a definition that we came to in the 1970s in particular, and have had to learn again and again, which is energy security is supply and market. And do you have it where you need it, when you need it? And as we've seen right now, we haven't really progressed. It doesn't matter that we're producing so much energy in the United States. Well, it matters, but it doesn't matter when you have a significant disruption in Russia, that this market and the vulnerability in it and how close to the margins it is, as far as what we consume and what is produced, has not changed that much. And so we are just as vulnerable today, which we're getting, again, an object lesson in, as we were in 1973, when I, as a child, was sitting with my mother in gas lines in Los Angeles. So, security depends on your point of view, but all of those are legitimate, real definitions. And they all come back to the fact that this is a foundational element of any economy throughout history, but especially of a modern economy that is so electrified and so mobile. Every minute of every day, we depend on a reliable supply of energy. And when we don't have it, the insecurity across our global economies, the insecurity of our daily life. You look at what's at stake in Europe, you're talking about people not having enough energy to heat their homes when it's cold. And we saw what that looked like in Texas. Michael saw what that looked like in Texas, especially up and close.
Yeah, and I was going to say that one of those elements is how quickly things come back.
Yeah.
In Texas, when the power went out or the heat went out, the one measure of our resilience is curious, well, how long were we out? How long did it take for us to come back? And it came back within a couple of days, which is good, because if it really collapsed, it could have taken 3 weeks or that kind of thing. And it's much different to be without electricity for 3 weeks as opposed to 3 days. 3 days is still miserable and people suffer, but 3 weeks is really a humanitarian crisis. And that's something we have to think about, is making sure it doesn't go out, but also making sure it can come back quickly when it does go out.
And I think the amazing thing about Texas, it was only 3 days, but people froze to death in their homes, right? I mean, it was still a crisis, but you look at what's happening in Mariupol in Ukraine right now, and of course it's everything, but this is a war that is so intimately wrapped up in energy that there are people there who are experiencing it as 3 weeks without energy, but it's also energy states fighting that are borne forward on a tide of energy revenue. So it's a really interesting, complex story how energy and security fit together.
Yeah, no, and to the doesn't change, right? Wherever you are, whoever you sit in, right? On and I think in the documentary, Matt, you've had some really fascinating clips, right? Bringing us back really to where, during the First World War, Second World War. And hearing what you said, Sharon, it makes me think about the Neville Chamberlain infamously said, of Czechoslovakia in 1938, this is not some quarrel in a faraway country between the people of whom we know nothing. I think the needs that Ukraine faces is the same needs that we have on a daily basis. So I think it will be interesting to see, what's different about Russia's aggression throughout Ukraine today compared to 2014.
It wasn't that different a story, for Iraq either, where people were experiencing, after the United States invaded in 2003, people in Iraq were experiencing, a crisis of availability of energy at the same time that the war is intimately tied into energy supplies. So, it's Ukraine, it's Iraq, all of this over and over again, we're seeing different variations on the same theme.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say as well? I think Michael and Sharon and anyone to chime in on that, on how to make sanctions work, right? Because as we hear a lot, whenever something happened, we'll do sanctions, right? And I think, we keep saying multilateral, we have to make, to make them effective, we have to make them as multilateral as possible, but also making sure that the impact are felt more on Russia than they are on us all. So how to make sanctions work here in that case?
I don't really know. I don't know much about sanctions, so I can't really comment on that. And there's a lot of evidence to my ignorant eye that maybe sanctions don't work. But there's also this feel like we can't do nothing, right? We have to do something. But one thing I'll comment for the audience to observe, that it doesn't look like a coincidence to me that the invasion happened in winter when it's really cold, when gas is needed in Europe to heat homes and buildings. And a lot of European countries like France and Italy and Germany buy gas from Russia. And when it's cold out, they don't want to turn off the gas because they need it for heating. And so that was probably a decision by Russia to invade when it was cold, when gas was needed, because Russia sells the gas and makes a lot of money from it. So these kind of things don't look accidental to me. And then to attack the energy infrastructure doesn't look accidental. So Sharon said earlier that energy shapes war. I would say energy is a cause of war. It sort of enables war. It is also a target of war. It is also something that enables our defense. Energy is a cause of war, but it's also a great sort of fortress for us. We can use our energy to defend ourselves better. So energy's role in the war is very complex, and then it affects even the timing of who does what when. As Matt said earlier, it's not just in the summer. Invading in the winter you wouldn't have done 300 years ago, but now it's actually a good time to invade because the people who are affected by you might be less likely to turn off the gas you're selling them. So that's what it looks like to me. And I think that's tied in with sanctions and everything else, but I don't have any smart comments on that.
I don't know, Sharon, if you want to chime in on that part.
I think, sanctions are always sound like they're, a pressure point and not very harmful, but they're definitely a weapon of war. And it's, just a different kind of war. And they're a war that also a weapon that can be indiscriminate. I think in the case of Russia, a lot of these sanctions, because of the nature of that government and the fact that all the revenue coming in from commodities there's a lot being skimmed off the top. I was just listening to an Economist story where they said in the 20 years that Mr. Putin's been in power, there's been $4 trillion in revenue from oil and gas coming in, and he's had a huge cut of that. So his economy is extremely sensitive to those commodity markets, and his personal revenue, and remember, his political power is entirely dependent on being able to distribute that revenue out to his allies, extremely sensitive to these markets. So these sanctions, he's been trying to sanction proof his economy for some time now. But what's really evident now is that he can't fully do that, that there's too many levers that the rest of the global economy has to affect him. And he's too vulnerable to that kind of effect because of the sort of thinness of his economy and the corrupt nature of it. So these sanctions are definitely biting. And, the thing is that pain is going to be visited on the Russian people, not just on the oligarchs and the president, but it's also going to redound to us. The longer they go on, the more those ripple effects are going to go out across the economy. Again, because you're talking about oil, gas, wheat, titanium, and other minerals that are global commodities that the entire global economy trades and relies on. So when you constrain Russia's access to global markets, you also constrain your own. So that it's all going to be that way.
I have one thing to add about the sanctions topic. It's not exactly a sanction, but the word embargo is the word that was used to talk about what the United States did after Japan had invaded China in the 1930s. And the embargo was essentially Japan was getting a lot of their oil from us, the majority of their oil from the United States. And we cut them off, of course, because morally we didn't want to participate in what they were doing. We didn't want to fund what they were doing in China and places like Nanking, things like that. And we didn't really necessarily know how Japan was going to react to that. And they ended up, bombing Pearl Harbor. There's not a direct line between those two things, but there's an indirect line and a connection that sometimes, if we it's a tricky balancing act. And I think sometimes if you end up causing so much pain with one thing, you could get a reaction that you don't necessarily want. And you could argue that it was inevitable that Japan was going to attack the United States anyway. But the reason that Japan, started that aggression against us was because we cut them off from oil. So.
Yeah, no, and you're bringing a great point here, which, I want to extend on. You mentioned critical minerals. So I'll be jumping in different topics like the documentary does, because you're covering so many different aspects of energy that deserves to be mentioned here. Sharon, you wrote an amazing piece, which I really recommend, called I Am Titanium. I think it's a terrific piece that looks at titanium, which is one of the 35 minerals that the US government designed and describe as critical. Right now, everyone came to the realization that they are part of that Ural family of, like you say, of minerals, and titanium having a critical role there. So I will be curious if you can kind of give us a synopsis of the importance of critical minerals, especially in times of war right now. And like Matt said, right, all those tanks, all those war means that are being used depend heavily on critical minerals. I would love to hear everyone's kind of take on that aspect.
I mean, I think we're getting, a very brutal look right now at the destructive power of war, and that when nations go to war, cities get laid waste and people die, and it's a terrible thing. But the other flip side of it is that war is a very consumptive activity. It takes a lot of materials to support a war and even to prepare for a war. And critical minerals are both fuel and critical minerals like rare earth elements and lithium and cobalt and titanium. They're inputs to a war capability. So they're an important part, but those minerals are also essential for the information technology that we all depend on now for this modern economy that we're all using, that you probably all have a phone, right? It's a periodic table of minerals. And so your ability to have that depends on a steady supply, but also the energy transition. If we're going to get ourselves out of this fossil fuel trap and go to a different kinds of energy, we are switching from fuel minerals to non-fuel minerals. And there's still a supply chain there. And the article I was just reading in The Economist said that by their analysis, something like half of all the minerals you need for a new energy economy will still be coming from autocratic countries. So we're still going to have a challenge here, no matter where we switch, what kind of energies we switch to.
I'd love to build on that a little bit and give some more historical perspective, because it feels like to me that we've been shifting over time from strategic liquids like oil to strategic gases like methane to now strategic solids like these critical minerals. And so the 1970s, petroleum, still does drive the global economy, but when there were cutoffs from embargoes and then the two energy crises in the 70s, the world felt the pain. In the United States, we said, okay, oil imports are a national security problem. We spent a few decades trying to solve it by increasing domestic production, by reducing the amount of fuel we need for cars, the fuel efficiency, that kind of thing. And now we're like Europe, which imports a lot of natural gas or methane from Russia. And we say, well, their energy security problem is their gas imports. And so as the world decarbonizes and moves away maybe from so much oil and gas consumption, we'll use more other things, information technology, like Sharon just said, and renewables that need molybdenum and arsenic and cobalt, and all these things we just heard. Those are strategic solids that might or might not come from the United States or friendly countries, that might come from these other places. So we're just kind of shifting what our strategic dependence is. Although I would say, there is a difference with the strategic fuel like gas or oil versus the minerals. We use the minerals to build the device, the battery or the wind turbine, but we don't use the minerals to operate it the way we use the fuel. So today, maybe Russia can cut off gas to Europe, or the Middle East can cut off oil to the United States or something like that. And maybe China could cut off the minerals to us. That wouldn't affect our ability to operate our energy system, but it would affect our ability to build the next wind turbines and that kind of thing. Like Vladimir Putin can't turn off the wind in Texas or the sunshine of Florida, but it can't turn off the minerals. So we are just kind of dancing around. It's almost like whack-a-mole. We move from strategic liquids to strategic gases to strategic minerals, but there is some advantage of the minerals, which is operationally, once we build it, we're okay. So hopefully that means we're heading in the right direction, but it's different countries, different weaknesses, different supply chain issues for sure.
That's brilliant, Michael. And I think also the other thing about minerals is that they're recyclable. Like when you use oil, when you consume it, when you combust it, it's gone in a big cloud of smoke that erodes your atmosphere. Whereas minerals, most of them are recyclable. I mean, not when you're using them for weapons, but for most purposes. So there's some possibilities there. And also some of them are a lot more prevalent in the earth. They're just not recovered. And the process for recovering them is dirty and is concentrated. But that's something you can research. And there's hope there for diversification and for a better way to recover and process and use minerals.
Yeah. I see some questions coming in, and again, I want to make sure that that people also submit some questions. So I'll do one question coming in, and then I'll make sure that that you'll contribute as well and send question over. So I think the one of them is the whole role of globalization and deglobalization. I think that's a topic that came quite a bit at CERAWeek, for instance. When you look at it, the greater the number of trade partners, the more globalized the world. But it raises some really complex questions, which can be exemplified as such. If country X has a population of 5 million and has 10 energy trade relationship, while country Y has a population of 1 billion and has 12 energy relationship, which is the more globalized, right? So it kind of look at what's next for Russia, right? Given all the sanctions and Ukraine and so forth. So I think there were a lot of discussions about the energy crisis that will probably fuel deglobalization with supply chain, like you mentioned, in the critical mineral sphere, and manufacturing kept within the borders, a trend that really has been boosted already by the pandemic. But I'll be curious to hear, from kind of taking that questions on globalization versus deglobalization and energy. I think what we're seeing right now with Russia, Ukraine, we might be living in a world where new clubs of nations have formed, with fresh links between countries on the basis of sharing renewable energy, like you mentioned. And Michael, the supply of sunshine and wind is not evenly distributed across the world, but it's much more evenly distributed than fossil fuel right now, to add Sharon's point. So I would be curious to see what kind of new clubs of nation you would see in that new energy mix, and how it will make it possible without crisis and confrontation.
I say Matt probably have some comments, because we're actually, for Power Trip Season 2, have an episode on globalization. So probably have some comments, and I've got some thoughts on France versus the United States on supply chains after Matt.
Yeah, we are doing an episode called Globalization for Power Trip Season 2, and it looks at the role that energy has played in globalization. And one of the things that I've been learning as we traveled, we filmed at the port of LA, which was recently in the news because of the huge logjam of stuff that we were all ordering on Amazon and things during COVID that wasn't getting to us. But in terms of the globalization story and war and energy, and the question that you had about clubs of nations versus a big global economy, it kind of happened at the end of World War I. As all the way leading up to World War I, there was kind of a move towards globalization, this idea of maybe creating a League of Nations and things like that. And then World War I kind of ended the dream of that for a little while, and you had the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, and then the world kind of squared off again. And then out of that dust, was created the United Nations. And then later you had NATO and in the EU. So in my opinion, what I've been seeing since in terms of the interviews that I've been doing and the things I've been shooting for this new episode is that these things have happened before. It almost feels a little bit like we're headed back towards that. I don't want to overstate it. Maybe multipolar is too strong of a word, but these kind of like divisions of countries into these little clubs, as you said. And I think we have to just be cautious to not push people into those clubs along ideological lines too much, and start thinking more about, how do we all get access to the energy that we need.
And one on the supply chain sort of point, I would say in the United States in particular, our supply chains are very long. They are global, and so we have access to all sorts of things very cheaply, which is very convenient to live in America. We get cheap toys and cheap electronics and all sorts of things, and it might have been made 5,000 miles away. Our food is cheap, this kind of thing. In France, the supply chains are much shorter. So a typical supply chain in France might be 500 miles, in America might be 5,000 miles. And there are some advantages to the shorter supply chain. When I was in France when COVID started, in the United States, there was sort of panic buying of toilet paper, and stores ran out of toilet paper, which, by the way, someday we'll write entire books about the toilet paper panic of 2020, because I'm not sure what happened. And even HEB, which we love and is always prepared as a grocery store for everything, didn't see that one coming. But in France, they didn't have a toilet paper shortage. There are a couple of reasons. One is the French don't panic buy the same way Americans do. The French also don't have huge closets where they can store a year's worth of toilet paper, so they only buy a few weeks at a time. But the other thing is the toilet paper is most likely made in France and locally. There are local supply chains in France, so it's easier for the supply chains to adjust to things. So I think these shorter supply chains are more robust. They're less likely to be disrupted. However, you could argue that the longer supply chains are more resilient. They're easier to disrupt. But then if a factory goes down in Taiwan, but maybe you can go to a factory in Brazil instead. So you could argue that globalization makes for a more resilient system because you can go to a different supplier, this kind of thing. But the longer supply chains have more points of disruption, so they're more vulnerable is what it feels like. I don't know if that's really true, but that's anecdotally what it feels like to me. But we need to think about that. In the United States, we chase the cheapest thing, which is the longer supply chain. And the good news is that builds trade relationships. So maybe we build more allies and we're less likely to attack each other. Maybe that's a good outcome of it. If the supply chain is sending money to people who hate us, which is something Sharon kind of mentioned earlier, the people who make money off our supply chain, we're buying energy from people who use that money for bad purposes. That's probably a bad sort of form of a long supply chain. But we certainly have to think about this. And I think deglobalizing or relocalizing it has some advantages. It's not always cheaper, though. The goods in France are often more expensive than the goods in America, even though the supply chain is more robust.
Exactly. No, I mean, I have so many more questions for you all, but we're running out of time and I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. So that will bring us to the end of our panel discussion. And since you mentioned France, I do hope that this discussion for the second season will be in Paris over croissant and coffee, like we chatted earlier. But again, it was an absolutely a fascinating conversation. And I really, really wish that we would chat later and more, but I really appreciate all of your questions and contribution here. And everyone attending right now, really, really recommend you to look into Michael's and Matt and Sharon's background, but also the work they're doing and follow what they do, because there's a lot to learn from them. So thank you everyone for your time today, and especially to our panelists and to the students in school who join us. You are the future. And I really hope that watching the episode really motivates you to learn more about energy and educate yourself and share and ask questions and be passionate about that. So I also like to thank our sponsors, Itron Inc. and CPS Energy for making today's event possible. So thanks as well to KLR and Public Television for hosting the screening and conversation. And thanks all as well to our partners. University of Texas at Austin, Disco Learning Media, Alphys Media for your support. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about Power Trip, the story of energy, please buy the book, but also visit www.powertripshow.com. And if you're interested in energy and water education, there's a great website, which is www.smartenergyeducation.com. So smartenergyeducation.com. So please stay motivated and keep learning about energy. It's an amazing sector to be in. And, thank you again for that great conversation, and Michael for doing, and Matt and Sharon to be part of that journey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.